Hi, and welcome back to Live at FDIC, brought to you this year by Firehouse Subs. My name is Chris McLoone. I'm with Fire Apparatus and Emergency Equipment. If you've been watching the Fire Apparatus and Emergency Equipment podcast, you're very familiar with the two people to my left and my right here. First of all, this is Andy Soccodato, and this is Bill Adkins. We're all together, actually, this time, so we're not just peeking at you from behind a bunch of different cameras across the country. We're going to be talking water delivery today, and while there's no real crazy agenda, guys, today, we're going to answer your questions that you've sent in to us for use today, but also we're going to talk a bit about your classes, some of the stuff that you want to see while you're here. Just kind of get your feel for FDIC so far. We got a nice mix here today because we've got two people who use the equipment all the time that's out there on the floor, but also they're here to teach and instruct on that as well. So, fellas, I'm going to start with you, Bill. Before we get into the questions in earnest, talk about your class. What is your class on this year? When are you giving it? Give us a clue.
Yeah, my class is Rural Water Movement Operations. It's Wednesday at 10:30, classroom 136 and 137. We'll be going over setting up different strategies and tactics for water movement. Setting up the scene. In the city community, urban, they know that they're going to hit a hydrant every time. Right. And the rural community, it's not always that way. So I go over quite a few different techniques that the departments can take back, do some research, what works best for the equipment that they have, and set up their own water movement for every time they go on any scene.
When you do that, do you get kind of not blank stares, but because really what people have is different across the board, right. There could be rural fire departments out there that are using, apparatus from the 70s, and they haven't been able to update their some of the water supply components that a lot of us have today, but not everybody does. Do you ever get kind of like well, Bill, everything you said was great, but do you ever get that?
I get that all the time, and this is now my 10th year of doing this class here. See a lot of new faces. I see a lot of faces again for the next year. But yeah, they have different equipment, and that's why I go over such a vast of types of rural water movement. It's not just one, because everybody in their communities have different resources. And we need to make sure we can match their resources, because what works at Fayetteville or Loveland Sims right. does not work for a lot of departments out there. So we make sure we try to hit it all.
All right. Now, Andy here, he just got back from one place that he was instructing, and then he hops a plane and comes out to Indianapolis. Or I don't know if you drove. But anyway, you're all over the place, all around. But so talk about your class. Is it kind of a combination of what you're doing when you're out with the water thieves, or is it more of or is it more of something very specific and targeted for FDIC?
Yeah, so this year I'm presenting my advanced drafting operations class. This will be the 4th year that I've presented it here at FDIC, and it's an hour and 45-minute presentation. I'll be presenting it on Friday at 10:30. But really what we'll be focusing on in that class is the physics behind drafting, what really goes on in the pump, why are certain things happening when we're drafting. We're going to talk about how you can maximize your water supply when you're operating from static bodies of water. And then just some general tips and tricks and tactics for, how to be most efficient on your rural fire scenes when larger flows are required.
Going to be able to do that all in an hour?
It's going to be tight. It's going to be tight, but we're going to do the best. So it's going to be fast paced.
Oh, I'll tell you, there's a lot of theory in what you're doing. In fact, one of the questions we've got later is talking about designing the pump module, for those kinds of flows that you're talking about. And you're getting more into getting the flow to the truck and then out. All right, perfect. Well, we're at FDIC. We have not, everything's still being set up right now. If you get out there, if you get to the other end here, like all the trucks are in, so you can get a really good idea of what's being shown that way. If you don't bother the people polishing the trucks too much, you want to make sure you let them do their jobs. But I'll tell you, man, you walk in there. I said it yesterday on a video I did, just a quick one for Facebook. But really, when all those trucks move in, when it gets kind of quiet, all you smell is like the tire shine, the polish, and the wax. And, I mean, I love it. It reminds me of parade time.
Yeah, right.
It's like July 4th in there for me, but, man, it gets heavy. And, I mean, they look great. They really look great. But what are some of the products that you guys are looking for? I mean, like, I'm sure you're probably going to look at the rigs,
Sure.
but also, I mean, what we talk about all the time is water delivery, and there are a lot of components and appliances that go into that. So, Andy, I'll start with you this time. What are you most looking forward to this week? What are you looking to find out more about?
Well, I know
You've heard about.
I know that there are some manufacturers that are going to be debuting some new products for the first time. I won't go into names. I'll save that for them. But looking at intake valves and what movements are being made in the fire service, since there has been an awakening, it seems, for folks to put intake valves on their pumpers. People are understanding why that's important, and B, understanding that the size of that waterway really does matter. The larger the opening has a really big impact on what you're able to do on the fire ground, especially when it comes to larger flow operations. So seeing what manufacturers are doing there on the intake valve side of things, and then seeing what apparatus manufacturers are doing on the discharge side with larger plumbing and multiple discharge, large diameter discharges and things like that. So
based on some of the things that we've all been talking about over the past, I guess we started the FA podcast in August. But one of the things that I've been paying more attention to, we did one on intake valves, and something I was looking at this week when the trucks were moving in and everything is looking at those intake valves on the intake side and just seeing how the pump panels work with them. You know what I mean? Because I mean, you could really, there's some real knuckle crunchers sometimes.
Yeah,
if you don't do it, it's not the valve's fault, it's not the pump panel's fault. If you're not putting the work in when you're designing the truck to make sure that that everything's going to fit right on there, that's when things are. So it's something I've been more attuned to since we started doing this. But one thing about the intake valves to ask you about these days, I'm guessing this is going to be a Doug question, but there might be somebody else out there wondering as well. We at my fire company, when we went from our 81s to our 97s, we just took the intake valves off and brought them over, put them there. But I remember when we were doing a lot of pump testing and things of that nature, when we got them, there was a lot of friction loss in the valve. Have the valve manufacturers kind of worked that through where there's either little to none anymore?
So yes, the short answer is yes. The valves that are coming out today are getting and allowing you to get more volume through them with less loss. Generally speaking, when we're talking about pressurized water sources, it's negligible. It doesn't matter which brand you go. It's pretty negligible with the newer valves that are being produced today. Where it really becomes important is when we're drafting, because we only got 14.7 PSI of atmospheric pressure available. That's not a lot to overcome a lot of losses. So without naming brands, the testing that I have done with two of the newer valves on the market, we have been able to get just under 1,500 GPM from a draft. So the moral of that story is, and in my mind, the takeaway that I took when we were doing that testing was a lot of people are under the thought process that when I go and do my pump testing, I got to take the intake valve to get the full flow, and that's 100% correct. But some of the valves that are coming out today, they're allowing you to flow larger volumes. I could potentially keep the intake valve on for pump testing, and more importantly in the field, and get good flows out of it, right? A 2,000 GPM pump for pump testing purposes has to do it with two intakes anyway. So I could leave those intake valves on and reliably get 1,000 gallons a minute out of each intake without having to pop the valve off. And to me, that's a really big deal, especially for these departments that draft a lot and do rural water operations.
Okay. Bill, how about you? What are you looking forward to this week?
Well, yeah, so I just was notified of a new intake valve coming out this year, so I'm definitely going to go over and check that out. One of the other things I like to see is when I come to FDIC is the different tankers that are out there and the configurations. How can we get the most gallons per minute when dumping, and how much we can push forward to another apparatus? How they configure them so that when a department comes to me and says, Bill, we're about to buy another tanker. What should we how should we put it together? And I can come up with these, hey, I've seen this at FDIC that's going to work well for you. I've seen this at FDIC. It's not going to work for you for your resources. So those are the things I really like to look at when I'm at FDIC.
Okay. In your area where you are there more just straight water carrier tankers, or are there more pumper tankers?
So years ago, that was strictly water carriers. They would dump and go fill back up. But now more and more, we have a lot more nurse tanker or tankers with pumps that can push forward if they need to.
There's what you call a tanker and what you don't call a tanker kind of get, and I'm not talking the tanker tender thing. I'm talking like what, the number of gallons carried. Some people might consider a 1,000-gallon tank to be a tanker. Others, won't call it that until you get up to 1,500, 70, 50, 2,000. But what do you think about, there are a number of, when I think of a tanker, and this isn't it's not like a digger or anything, but automatically I always think of commercial chassis. But there are a lot of custom chassis rigs with those 1,000-gallon, and we're able to do so much with the configuration of the tanks and all those kinds of things these days. What do you see many of them out your way where it's 1,000 gallons, it's not quite a tanker, but it's really like a first in, you're going to be able to do a lot with it.
Yeah, most of the rural water engines in our area is 1,000 gallons or more.
Okay.
A lot of departments are now going to 2,500 and 3,000 gallon custom cab. So when they get there first, and they have a 6 firefighter cab, they have 6 firefighters showing up with more water to last them for a few more minutes in that fire before they have to worry about getting their water source.
Anything to give the guys finding the water source
a little more time. Yeah.
How about you? What are you seeing there?
I love the pumper tanker concept. A true custom cab with a larger water tank on the back, but a rig that is also built for function to serve as an attack engine. I'm gonna throw out, give a shout out to my buddies up in Mechanicsville, Maryland. They have it's a beautiful pumper tanker that they're running up there that's carrying 2,000 gallons of water, but they run that rig as a potential second due engine, or in certain scenarios where it might be the first arriving pumper. They got low hose beds and they can deploy lines off real easy, but they're still showing up with 2,000 gallons of water. So the major difference between their tanker and their engine is really the second axle on the rear end, and the tanker has more water, right? And it works really, really well for them. And personally, that's my favorite configuration for short-staffed fire departments that can get enough staffing for a full engine company and then somebody bring the tanker. I can bring it with one full crew, and it works for some, not so much for others, but it's my personal favorite.
It's amazing what the manufacturers are able to put together now. Everything is a trade-off. You just mentioned that a minute ago. But with apparatus design, everything is a trade-off. If you go with a bigger tank, then you might have to have a higher hose bed. But what my point here is just it's amazing what the manufacturers are doing these days to really make these as compact as possible, yet still as fully functional
as possible.
It really
it's like when it came out with the Quint.
Yeah.
A ladder truck with a pump and a tank. It's dual purpose, just like the tankers are nowadays. They're dual purpose. They can still dump and they can still pump.
Now, with your teaching, both of you get around to a lot of different departments. You come here to FDIC, but more in line with when you are going to departments to teach. When you get there, what is typically the biggest challenge that the department has when you get there? You're going to teach, either one of you are going to teach like water delivery, rural water supply, finding the sites. But is it more of a just not necessarily up to, I don't want to say up to speed, but up to date on current practices? Or is it more like we were talking about a minute ago, where it's old equipment that that's the challenge. It's that they're trying to do what you need to do, but it's with you. I don't know. What do you see? What are the challenges that are presented to you when you show up at the bay door?
Yeah, the things I see is what inspired me to do the FDIC class in the first place. I show up to these departments the first few months of teaching them, and they have no systematic approach of what they do when they first arrive on the scene. It's 4 or 5 firefighters getting off the rig, and they're just basically looking for a company officer to tell them what to
gotcha.
do.
Okay.
I like to hone their skills into when they get off the truck, that if a firefighter has a clear and decisive strategy or a tactic that they need to do, if their job is to hit the hydrant, they know exactly what they got to do. They don't have to be told. And that goes with all the things in the fires and on the fire ground. In his first few minutes, the officer needs to go do their walk around, start sizing up things. What can those firefighters do instead of standing still, waiting for that officer to tell them? They already should have that in place. And when they do get off the rig, they know exactly what their job is and do it to the best of their ability. And that's where training comes in to do that task. If it's pulling a line off, if it's setting up the water supply, their job is they're to train to do that to the best of the ability.
So it's more along the lines of the tactics involved once you get there versus an equipment thing.
Yeah.
It's almost like it doesn't matter what age the equipment is, they're still waiting for the direction to put it in service.
Right.
And that's where you're trying to, I guess, break down that barrier.
Right.
Okay.
And
I'm sorry.
I would say in those urban departments, where in the cities, they all have their job
Right.
to do.
Yeah, right.
And I'm trying to, I'm not trying to change the rural community to the city, but they still, what works in the city can work in the rural setting as well.
And you've got both. I mean,
Yeah.
You've got both sides with your career. Yeah, both as a career firefighter
Yeah.
and a volunteer.
I've been fortunate enough to take what I've learned from Lovell and Sims and at Fayetteville and combine them, and that's what I try to teach here at FDIC.
Good deal. How about you, Andy? What is the biggest challenge that they come to you with when you get there?
For me, it usually falls into one of three things. Number one is, like you said, equipment, right? But here's what I tell people. Equipment, yeah, it can be a problem, but I can budget for equipment. It may not be after a class. I always tell people, by the end of this class, you're probably going to have a wish list this long of things that you want on the rig. But while you may not be able to get that, at the drop of a hat, I can budget for that. And I know the direction I need to go. So to me, that's not the be all end all. The other two are typically mindset. We've always done it this way, or we've never needed to twin tube draft, or we've never needed to put a pumper on a hydrant at a fill site, right? And a lot of times, what I ask back is, have you not needed to do that? Or did you not know that you should do that, right? So, and a lot of times people can't answer that, right? Just because you haven't done it in the past doesn't mean it didn't need to be done, right? So I always like to encourage folks in my classes to keep an open mind, because we're not going to show you party tricks. We're not going to sell you snake oil, right? We're showing you things that work. And then honestly, the last thing that tends to hem some people up is just lack of pre-planning in the rural setting, right? A lot of people don't think or don't recognize how important it is just to say, you know what, I know there's a lake over here. It's got all the water in the world. I just don't know how to get to it. Or if I had to get to it, what would I do? Or how would I set up this fill site? Or if I'm going down this road, what's the best way to set up my dump site, right? And almost, the thing I see a lot of rural fire departments do is they shoot from the hip when it comes to water supply. Like Bill was saying, well, we'll figure it out when we get there, or a company officer will tell me. A football team doesn't shoot from the hip. They got a playbook, right? So in the water supply world, why not have a playbook of, hey, these are where these water sources are for this area. Yep, we can go here, 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 and here. Or you know what? It's dry in this part of the year at that source, so that's going to be low. Whatever. Having an idea, you're already 100 steps ahead of the game when the fire drops at 2 a.m, right? So
I'm going to throw out to you guys one that is not on the list. And it was one I meant to put on the list, but I think you'll be okay with it because I mean, with your article that you gave. So you guys recently wrote a 2-part article. We ran the first one in March. We're running the second one in May. And I feel that the most important, it was on equipment, essential equipment that a rural engine company should have on its rig to get started with water supply. And I actually thought, I'm going to ask you guys what you thought the most important piece of equipment that you had on that list is. I think, and I'm not sure if I'm going to say it right. Is it the chafing
block?
I think it's the chafing block. I swear that was the most practical. All the other stuff that you guys talked about, this simple wooden
plywood,
that you can build at any time, seemed to me to be almost the most practical and the most important thing,
and the cheapest.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
What do you got, Bill? I'll start with you.
All right, chafing block was amazing to me too. I thought it was great. A lot of times we get on the scene, we're trying to, one firefighter's got to, because we're low staffed. So, one firefighter trying to put together 2 sections of hard suction is it's almost impossible. And that chafing block area is real nice. But the other thing I would say would be the intake valves. A lot of departments in the rural communities, you won't see them intake valves on there. And as soon as they open up that cap, what are we going to lose? We're going to lose water. And then now you're trying to put that all together.
Right? You lose options too.
Yeah, you sure do.
Right.
You sure do. So the intake would probably be my answer. The most important.
How about you?
I love the chafing block. It's quick and easy. It serves a lot of uses. But like Bill said, intake valves are a must. And then after that, if I had to pick my top 3, the third one would be hard sleeve, right? Obviously, everybody knows a rural engine is going to be carrying hard sleeve, but a lot of times people don't realize how much I should be carrying, right? Yeah. 20 feet of hard sleeve on an engine usually is never enough. And people are like, well, shoot, I'm just drafting out of a tank that's right next to the rig or right off, off a front intake. And that's fine, but I need to be thinking about how am I going to transfer water from tank 1 to tank 2? Or tank 2 to tank 1, or tank 3 to tank 1. And I can chew through 50 feet of hard sleeve really quickly, setting up a fairly basic dump site, right? Never mind if I'm getting into a more challenging fill site where, I can park the rig here. I got all the water in the world, but it's going to take me, 40 feet to get deep enough into the water, right? So hard sleeve to me is the next one.
Of course, I want people to read the article, but
Sure.
what I didn't do is ask you to describe the chafing block.
Yeah.
Could you just go through what
Absolutely.
that is?
So all the chafing block is a piece of plywood, and there's no magic dimensions. What I love about it is you can cut it to whatever you want based on your compartments and whatever you need for your rig. But basically, you cut a divot, kind of make it look like an hourglass, if you will, and then on the end, I do the same thing. And what that allows me to do is obviously in the urban environment, if I have soft sleeve that's sitting there rubbing, I can lift it up and prevent it from wear. Or if I got water that's pooling, I can prop it up and let water drain away from the truck. But what I love it for in the rural setting is, like you all talked about, being able to connect 2 sections of 6-inch hard sleeve together, whether it be Stort's fittings or threaded connections. All I'll do is I'll take that chafing block and I'll put the male end and support it like this. So now my male end is suspended, okay? And I can come with the female end on the other section of hard sleeve and just rest it between my knees, and I can guide those connections in, and now I can use my other hand to make the connection, right? So it's essentially an extra set of hands when I'm operating by myself. And I've put, 5 sections of sleeve together, just taking the board and going to the next, going to the next, going to the next. And, it rocks on pretty easy.
Those homegrown things.
It's homegrown, yeah. And I'll tell you, I picked that idea up. It's not my idea. I stole it from the city of Charlottesville, Virginia. That's what we had in the front bumper trays of our pumpers, and that's what we did.
All right. Sorry, I'm looking at the questions here that we had. Getting into a little bit more of the questions that we got. Now, this one's more of a pump design question. So it's really kind of talk about once we get the water to the truck, what are we going to do with it? And what made me think of it was I had Ricky Riley on a couple shows ago, and we were talking about pump panels. And he was talking about how they discovered after they took delivery of a bunch of pumpers that because they had decided to make them more compact, the piping and everything behind the pump panel was really creating a tremendous amount of friction loss. So the question is, how do you design a pump module for optimum water flow? I'll start with you.
Yeah. So not to give a cop-out answer, that's a loaded question because there's a lot that goes into it. The first thing you need to ask yourself is, what are the needs of your organization? What do you need? The next thing that I'm going to urge all the viewers to take a look at is the podcast that Dennis Laguerre and Rick Mosier did with Chief Rhodes on functional plumbing and layout of the pump panel. And they bring up a lot of good stuff on this exact topic. But one of the most important things that I think that you should ask yourself is, what do you expect to flow out of your discharges? And a lot of people think most fire engines today are being purchased and spec'd with large diameter discharges because the majority of the American Fire Service is in large diameter hose. And when people are writing a spec, they'll simply put, we want an LDH discharge. Well, to an apparatus manufacturer, that doesn't mean squat. So depending on what their standard practice is and how competitive they need to be to compete with other manufacturers, they'll give you a large diameter discharge, but it's only plumbed with 3-inch plumbing. Okay. So now I have a choke down. And while it meets the intention or the letter of your spec, it's not the intention of your spec. So I encourage folks to go and read the NFPA 1900 standard, but the NFPA standard lists what the minimum flow rates for certain pipe diameters are on a pumper. 2.5 inches, 250 gallons a minute. 3-inch plumbing is only 375 gallons a minute, and 4-inch plumbing is 625 GPM. So that's the minimum flows that plumbing needs to be able to support. Now, it can typically support more than that, but the question becomes how much more. And I see a lot of fire departments that get pumpers with 3-inch large diameter discharges, and they hook their 5-inch hose to it, and they're shocked that they can't flow much more than 1,000 gallons a minute. And they're sitting here saying, man, I got 5-inch hose. I should be able to flow 2,000 GPM. Well, you're trying to jam so much water through that plumbing, there is restriction. So, I recommend to folks, if your pump panel and layout can afford it and your purse strings can afford it, 4-inch plumbing is really the gold standard for a municipal pumper. And then if you're going to be doing a lot of large flow operations, 2,000 gallon per minute from a source to a tower ladder or something like that, really consider speccing 2 large diameter discharges on your pumper, 2 4-inch large diameter discharges. That way you can perform a parallel supply line operation very easily without having to use manifolds and lengths of 3-inch or 2.5 to come in and all of that. A lot of people forget that when a pump is rated for 2,000 gallons per minute, that is at a draft, but that is using multiple discharges, right? So when we do a pump test on a 2,000 gallon per minute pumper, we're using multiple discharges to get that rating. Well, that physics remains the same on the fire ground. I can't expect to flow 2,000 gallons a minute out of one discharge without a lot of loss.
Oji, what are your recommendations for pump modules for maximal flow?
Yeah, so Andy talked about the discharges. I want to talk about an intake. And when I'm referring to the intake here, I'm talking about the tank, the pump.
Okay.
Our first few minutes on the fire ground, a lot of times we're using our tank water, and whether it be urban or rural setting. And I'm talking mostly rural setting. When I set up, when I spec out our rig, if we just use the tank water, tank the pump, we're only going to get around 750 gallons a minute. You can have a 2,000 gallon pump all you want, but you're not going to flow 2,000 gallons a minute. It's going to be around 750 gallons a minute. When I spec out an apparatus, I always include a second tank to pump for a couple of different reasons. And that's one, if we are on flat ground, you can get almost all of your tank water. But if you're on a hill and now my water is shifted to the back of the truck, I can't get quite a few hundred gallons of water. So I like to get a tank to pump on the front and the back going to our pump if we need be. That way we can utilize all of our tank water. And by doing that second tank to pump, you have more volume of water going into your pump so that you can push forward or put water to your fire ground more than that 750 gallons a minute. The tanker helped design a few years ago has 2 4-inch tank to pump valves or lines, and it's able to flow almost 1,500 gallons a minute by those just from the tank water.
Yeah, and one thing Bill mentioned, right? It's important to understand that The NFPA 1900 standard only says that the tank to pump has to be able to flow 500 gallons a minute. So a lot of pumpers may be able to do more than that, but according to the standard, it only has to do 500 gallons a minute if the tank is 500 gallons or greater. So you could be even further restricted if you don't even realize it, right? So big thing, large tank to pump lines, I agree 100%, and dual sumps with dual lines for especially tankers or hilly environments. Mm-hmm. We just worked on a spec for the Sevierville Fire Department in Tennessee, and they're very, very hilly. They're in the Smoky Mountains, right? So their pumpers all are going to have on this new spec all front and rear sumps. So that way they'll always be able to get their full tank.
Mm-hmm. I know we're mostly talking about rural, but I do have a hydrant question.
Yeah.
It's one that comes up from time to time, but it's just one that sometimes needs a little more explanation about. So could you just, Bill, I'll start with you on this one. Talk about pumping two hydrants on the same main and why that's often not such a hot idea.
Yeah, so depends on the size of the main is what my answer would be. Short answer, in the rural setting, a lot of times the main is only 6 or 8 inches, and you're not going. If you're trying to use 2 steamers, that's 4.5 plus 4.5. That's already 9 inches of water that you're requesting out of this main, and you're going to drop that pressure on that main to below the 20 psi, which is what the water works are going to tell you they don't want it to go under. So if you have a 20-inch main, you can probably do 2 hydrants on the same main. Just remember, if you are using those 2 hydrants on that same main, if that main goes down, you're going to lose both hydrants at the same time. So that's just something you need to keep in mind. Make sure we're opening up our valves slowly, and that's not just the hydrant itself. Whenever you open up the valve or close a valve on your rig, it needs to be slow as well, so it can prevent the busted mains.
Yeah, so like Bill said, main size is everything. So this is where it's important for a fire department, and I'm sure most organizations, at least urban organizations, they're pretty good about flow testing hydrants, or at least having somebody flow test them. But the question that the fire department has to ask is, how are we flow testing them? Because there are 2 ways that the NFPA 291 standard says that they can be tested. We can do individual hydrant flow testing, or we can do main capacity flow testing. And the long and the short of it is that the main capacity flow test involves 2 hydrants in order to do that, where the individual is just 1. So the main capacity is truly telling you what the main is able to deliver in that system. And typically it'll give you higher flows. So if I know that my main is capable of giving me 4,000 gallons a minute, I don't have a problem at all hooking 2 engines to 2 hydrants that are on that same main and moving 2,000 gallons a minute apiece. But how do you know that in the scene, right? You might not. So what I tell people, the down and dirty way to figure it out is, if you suspect that the second hydrant is going to be tied to the same main and you don't know if the water's there, you hook a pumper to the hydrant that you're expecting to use, open the hydrant, open your intake, and get an idea of what that intake pressure is. If that intake pressure is reading the same as what it is at the pumper that's already pumping the first hydrant, then you know they're on the same main, okay, first off. And if they're both down near 20 pounds, that means you probably tapped the system. But if the pumper down at the fire scene or closer to the fire scene, the first hydrant, has 30 pounds of intake pressure, and the hydrant that you're on is showing 80 pounds, even if they're on the same main, what that's telling me is, hey, there's a pile of water left in the main. I can use this hydrant as my second water source. It's acceptable to use it even though it's on the same main.
Okay. In those rural settings, the road is many miles long, and there's not grids like there is in the city. So you don't have a choice but to hit a hydrant on the same main.
Right. The next main may be 2 miles down the road, right?
Sure. Yes. Yeah.
So kind of keeping with this a little bit, we're talking about fire attack now, at the engine. So besides mounting pump discharges for various lines somewhere near the pump panel, so, just a list somewhere, what are some other ways to quickly figure out pump discharge pressures for the required flows for longer hose lays? So what I'm thinking is, you deploy your cross lane. Oops, Now you've got to add, 50 to 100 more feet or something like that. Besides, what are just some quick ways to figure all this out? 2:30 in the morning, you're foggy. What are some of the ways that we can do that?
Yeah, so depending on the hose that you're doing, and for attack engine operations, it's obviously very important to make sure your pressures are dialed in. On the supply side of things, I get a little bit more lenient because I'm not worried about exact pressures from the standpoint of it has to be exactly this number, because there's not somebody on the other end of that supply line that is, fighting nozzle reaction or fighting fire, right, so to speak. So when I'm dealing with 1 3/4 hose, I like to use a method called the hand method. All right, I've heard it called the rule of 12s, and essentially what it does is I know what the flow rate is based on looking at my thumb, starting at 100 gallons a minute and going in 25 GPM increments. So 100, 125, 150, 175, 200. And then depending on what the flow is, I can figure out what the friction loss is. So let's say I want 150 gallons a minute, right? I know that's my 1, 2, 3rd finger. And then I multiply 3 by 12. That gives me 36 pounds per 100 foot, right? So I like dumbed down simple math. So I'm going to call it 35, because if I got to add 200 extra feet, I know that's another 70 pounds, right? So some people are going to sit here and say, man, that's a lot of friction loss, right? That's not right. That is using the older coefficients of 15.5. So for modern hose, right, I just changed the rule up a little bit. For stuff that has really, really, really low friction loss characteristics, you can use the rule of 6. So instead of multiplying 3 by 12, it's 3 by 6. Or my favorite, and this is pretty dialed in for most stuff on the market today, I call it the rule of 10s, right? So I can make it even easier. 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, right? So if I want 150 gallons a minute, that's my 3rd finger, that's 30 pounds of loss per 100 foot.
And that really means you got to know the hose.
You got to know your hose.
Because it's all over the place.
100%.
So, Bill, how about you? Any tricks of the trade you can mention for that?
No tricks of the trade. It's all about the pre-plan. I don't want our operators to try to figure this out at 2 o'clock in the morning. When we first get our hose in, we first get a new apparatus in, we are going to hook up to the discharges, and we're going to flow meter it using a flow gauge. And we are going to do what our standard cross lay would be, find out what that pressure is, and we're going to put it in the book. If we add 100 feet to it, we're going to put it in the book. Yeah, we're just going to keep going until we get around 600 or 700 feet. And if we need to add hose to the cross lay or the flying standpipe, it's all going to be in the book. They don't have to try to figure it out at 2 o'clock in the morning. They can just open the book. It's going to say, oh, we've added 200 feet. It's going to be this. Because every apparatus is a little bit different.
Yep,
we can say 150 gallons, or 150 psi, but when we get the new rig in, now it's 160 or 130.
Well, that goes back to what you were talking about before, plumbing characteristics within the truck, right? I'm with Bill 100%, right? You should absolutely, whenever you get a new rig, or even at your old rigs, if you've never done it, you should go and flow test every discharge, right? And figure out, okay, hey, what am I supposed, we know we want 150 gallons a minute out of the nozzle, all right? But what do we really have to pump that at? And your gauge is going to read different depending on how the plumbing is because of loss within the pump, right? So developing those pump charts is a must, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's something Andy taught me is when we do those flow testings, we don't just have the lines straight out. Put bends in them because there's friction loss in those bends.
Yeah, lay the hose out as if you would be going into a fire, right? That makes it your numbers more realistic.
Right.
This one is specifically for Andy, and it came in. It's about one of the podcasts we did a while back, 4-way valves at the hydrant. But I want you to comment on it too once Andy gets through it. When you talked about the drill and putting a pressure gauge on the hydrant with a 4-way valve and doing a long forward lay to show the amount of friction loss in the hose and the remaining pressure on the hydrant, can you walk me through the gauge you used and the specific setup?
Perfect.
You want to read it again?
No, I got it. So this drill and really what we're showing here is designed to get people to understand there's friction loss in large diameter hose. I cannot tell you how many times I go places, especially fire departments that are in 5-inch hose, that sit there and think, well, it's 5-inch. There's no loss. There's no loss in 5-inch. That's what this drill is designed to do, and also to show why four-way valves are helpful. So here's what we do. We essentially stretch our supply line. I like to go, if it's 5-inch, put 800 foot on the ground, right? That's a good amount of friction. And I'm going to try and flow 1,000 gallons a minute, okay? Rough ballpark numbers, there's 8 to 10 pounds per 100 foot at 1,000 gallons a minute. So my hydrant, under hydrant pressure, is going to fill that line. And because the friction loss in the hose, I'm not going to get 1,000 gallons a minute unless the hydrant just has stupid pressure, which it probably doesn't, okay? So the gauge that we're putting on the hydrant, all we're doing is putting, it can be just a regular cap gauge that you use for hydrant testing. It can be the gauge that's in your standpipe high-rise kit and just put a cap on it, just something that reads pressure. What I'm trying to work with a manufacturer now to make is a built-in pressure gauge gate valve setup. So that way it's a gate valve that you'd normally put onto your hydrant for any regular hydrant connection, but it has a pressure gauge on it. So that way it's always reading the pressure at the hydrant. So when you do that, right, you start flowing and the pumper's intake is going to have a low residual intake pressure because of the friction. You walk the students back to the hydrant and you can see that the hydrant pressure gauge is reading, I don't know, 60 pounds, whatever it's reading. And that proves that there's water in the system. There's water left to be had, but the friction in the hose is causing a much lower flow rate at the fire scene. And that shows why it's important to put pumpers on the hydrant, whether that be tie that pumper into the hydrant from the beginning, use a four-way valve, transition over, whatever it may be in your jurisdiction. But the big thing to remember is that we're operating pumpers, not pullers, right? So if I have a pumper all the way down at that fire scene, right, that hydrant can't overcome the friction. I need another pumper to overcome the friction.
And I'll let you comment on that in a second. But one of the things that I was just thinking about when you started your answer, there is this, not necessarily a misconception, but maybe you get into a bad habit of thinking there's no friction loss in the 5-inch line. It's negligible compared with like an 1 3/4 line, but it's still there.
But the key there is what you said is it's negligible compared to an 1 3/4 line if they're flowing the same amount.
Gotcha.
100%, right? 160 gallons a minute, 200 gallons a minute through through 1 3/4 compared to 5-inch. Yeah, it's negligible. I'm not going to worry about it. And in my opinion, this is where we as a fire service have gotten into bad spots because we're thinking of it from the mindset of a 1 or 2 hand line fire where, yeah, the 5-inch will give me the water with very minimal loss for those flows. But it's that 1 or 2 ladder pipe fires where now all of a sudden, man, we got no water.
Right.
And is the question I always ask after the fact is, did you not have water, or was it a poor setup on the hydrant, meaning that you didn't have a pumper on the hydrant to pump water to the fire scene that limited your flow, right? Usually, and it pisses off the municipal water authority, they get the flack.
Right.
But a lot of times the municipal water authority is like, hey, no, we got the water in the hydrants. It's our inability to maximize it and use it that gets us into trouble.
What about you, Bill? I mean, like, I know it's, this was specifically for Andy, but like, when you teach, like, what are some of the things that you go through to just demonstrate, that, there is friction loss in these larger diameter hoses?
Well, Andy said it best. The friction, pumpers are made to push water, not necessarily take in water. We don't really use four-way valves in both departments that I work with, but I have used them. And when we show up to a scene, that we want a pumper at the fire scene. Mm-hmm. When we say keep a pumper at the hydrant, well, people get confused to, am I supposed to park here and then we take the firefighters, 600 feet away with a line? No, we need to still lay in, use that four-way valve so that the next pumper comes in and can push that water forward. And luckily for me, Loveland Sims, we have a very good water. We don't have a problem with the water, so the four-way valve is not really needed. And in the rural setting where I'm at Fayetteville, we don't use hydrants at all because we don't have them. So that's why we don't really use the FOIA valve. That's probably why the video or that question was pretty much towards Andy, because I don't have a whole lot of experience on the FOIA valve.
Okay. This one came in, and this is one I threw it out to you guys to see if we ought to ask it, and we all agreed, we probably should, because logically the question makes sense. Like you're thinking, well, if I can do this and get all this water, why wouldn't we do it? And the question goes, and this is from Carl McDonald. I'd like to hear the guy's thoughts on being able to draft from a drop tank while simultaneously pumping off a hydrant, all with the same rig. And he was like, what are the possibility, the potential issues, the hazards, or if it could even be established, what limitations would this present? And, it's a pretty straightforward answer, but it is one that that does warrant, some explanation, and just to explain, why, it's not really something that we want to get into. So Bill, I'll start with you on that one. Talk about whether or not you should do that or not.
Yeah, I would not do that. Pressurized we're trying to create a vacuum and bring in water from a draft. And then you got on the other side something pressurizing. It's just going to push right into that dump tank. Mm-hmm. It's going to bypass all your discharges. It's going to go right into that. So we're going to fill up our dump tank with the hydrant, but we're not going to be able to bring any water in, because our pressure from the hydrant is going to overcome the 14.7 psi from the atmosphere pressure to bring that water up into our pump. So if I was if I have a hydrant, I would say with this question, they probably have a hydrant that doesn't flow a lot of water. So maybe it's one of them filling hydrants, or
blow off.
They use the blow off, right? So I would take that hydrant, put a line on it, and put it into my dump tank, and maybe I can add a couple dump tanks to it, and just keep that water flowing from that hydrant into my dump tanks and create my draft that way. And if I wanted to do a twin tube draft to get more volume, then I would use it that way.
Okay.
Let that hydrant keep my dump tanks full. And I can draft as much water. I can use all three intakes if I need to. If I have a front discharge or intake, twin tube, triple tube, whatever it is, I can get the water I need out of that for that pumper.
Gotcha. Andy?
I agree 100%. The big thing to understand is I can't have positive pressure and a vacuum at the same time. The positive pressure is always going to win, and like Bill said, it's just going to blow out the other side. Mm-hmm. Now, something that I get asked at times is, well, what if I have a fire scene? I have my attack pumper at the fire scene, and they're operating from a fire hydrant. Everything's good, whatever. And we need to supplement the fire flow. Can I go and reverse out to this pond that's over, or this retention pond that's over by this big distribution warehouse, at this warehouse fire we're operating at, and have both supplies come into the pumper? The answer there is you can, because pressure's pressure. The attack engine will still receive positive pressure. Here's my recommendation. I would be hesitant, because there is, and a lot of things would have to go wrong for it to happen, but the possibility does exist that the engine on the draft could overpressurize and backfeed untreated water into the drinking water, and that's a problem. Now, if the hydrant that's being used is a private hydrant that isn't treated, then I wouldn't care, right? Because it's not treated water, and no worries. But let's say I have this large warehouse fire where I do need to supplement from two different sources. I'm going to keep the municipal water separate, and then I'm going to have my engine that's drafting out of a pond or whatever it may be pumped to another rig. So I have municipal water and static water. The flow is still going to the fire scene and where it needs to be, but I'm keeping those two legs, those two segments separated.
Okay. Well, that was all the questions that we had. I got to tell you, this has been a pleasure, being able to just turn my head, not sitting there trying to figure out which little screen to look at. In fact, when I'm at home, when we do these, when I'm in my office, I just have a camera set up. So I'm like, you guys are off to the side here on a monitor, and I'm just looking at the camera the whole time, hoping that I'm looking at whoever is talking at that moment in time. So, but thank you both very much for joining me today. I did, before we go, though, want to find out, Bill and Andy, if anyone is interested in having you come out to their department to do a little training, how can they contact us, Bill?
Yeah, phone number 513-317-3605. send me a text. I usually answer those a lot better. And I get a phone call from someone I have no idea. Just shoot me a text. You can email me at badkins@lsfd.org, and I'll get in touch.
Okay. Andy?
The easiest way to get a hold of me is through social media, the Water Thieves on both Facebook and Instagram. Or if you want to, schedule something or have a question, thewaterthieves@gmail.com is the best way to get a hold of us.
Perfect. Well, that's going to about wrap up this episode of Live at FDIC. I want to thank again Firehouse Subs for being our sponsor for this year. Guys, have a good one. Stay safe, and keep watching because there's a whole lot more content coming to you from FDIC. So again, Chris McLoone for FDIC. Have a good one and stay safe. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
For having us.